So thank you everyone for being here this evening. I'm excited to talk to you a bit about my research investigating the impacts of pesticides on pollinators, in particular bees. So first I want to talk about why we care about pollinators to begin with. They provide this really important service to us known as pollination. In the case of a bee, it's attracted to a flower because it has these really nice resources known as nectar and pollen that a bee likes to collect to bring back to their colony as a bit of a food source. And when a bee visits a flower, they really have to shove their head in there to get access to the nice sweet nectar that's kept at the base of the flower, like this bee is doing in the video on the left here. But as they're doing this, because the pollen is kept at the top of the flower, they, without knowing it, kind of get covered with pollen grains all over the head and the rest of the hair in their body. And then they hop from flower to flower, bringing this pollen around with them. And this pollen contains important genetic material which the plant needs for reproduction. And this is where we benefit from this service, because as these bees hop around from plant to plant, they're accidentally dropping these pollen grains, and this is how a plant creates its seed. And we benefit from this in many ways, because seeds can come in the form of things like strawberries and cacao and apples and many other delicious foods. So if it wasn't for this service, we would have a very boring diet. But a lot of you have probably heard in the media lately that bees are in decline, which is of concern, especially for these important pollination services that they provide. One of the reasons for this is climate change, with extreme temperatures affecting bee health and survival. Another is fewer resources for them to feed on and sites for them to nest. This is particularly due to the expansion of the agricultural industry. Also, the spread of disease is of concern, especially with honeybees, because they have this mite that kind of hitches onto their back and can cause the spread of disease between colonies. And also the widespread use of pesticides, which is what the focus of my research is on. So in agriculture, pesticides can be used as sprays or as a little coating on seeds. And this is to just help control pest populations, as well as the economic damage that they do to the crops. And some of these pesticides are really effective because they can spread throughout the whole plant, protecting everything from the leaves to the stem and so on. But this also means that residues of these pesticides can end up in the pollen and the nectar of the plant. So when a bee is foraging on these crop flowers, they're accidentally ingesting some of these chemicals. And typically farmers might spray different types of pesticides at different times. So as bees are hopping from flower to flower and from farm to farm, they can be ingesting a concoction of different types of chemicals and concentrations of them. And previous research has suggested that when bees are exposed to these kind of levels of pesticides, it can really have some serious sublethal effects, which means that they don't necessarily die straight away, but it can affect their health and behavior in other ways. So in some cases, they maybe can't find their way home after they've been out on a foraging trip. And other times they can't actually learn how to use a flower and get access to these important floral resources. And in other cases, it just affects their health and the growth of their colony throughout the life cycle. So what is it that I do in all of this and contribute to this research? So typically I can be found sometimes just running around a field looking at wild populations of bees, and other times I can be somewhere a bit more controlled in the lab or outside and looking at them on a more finer scale and in a more controlled environment. And one of the important research questions that I want to ask is how pesticides affect bumblebee hibernation, and from that, their ability to produce a healthy colony the next year. So what this involves is I have these commercial colonies in the lab that I can take bumblebee queens out of, and I get them to mate with a male bee in these specific flight cages. And after that, we give them a pesticide treatment. So this is through a sugar water solution that we contaminate with a specific concentration of pesticide. So they feed on that, and once they're finished, we put them into a cold fridge for 3 months for them to hibernate. And we recently woke up some of these bees lately, and we started to see some trends on the survival of these these queens after hibernation. So if you look at the graph here, the pink and the white bar on the left represent two different compounds, compound X and compound Y. And as you can see, the survival of these queens after hibernation was lower than that of the control bees that didn't receive any pesticides. And we can see specifically with compound Y in the white bar that it's quite a bit lower than that of the control bees. This is really important data for us to have, because for every queen that doesn't survive hibernation, that's a whole colony of bees that doesn't go on to be produced and raised that season. So you can see that for every bee that doesn't survive, that's quite an impact on the overall population of bees over time. And so the rest of the queens that we have in the lab that have survived have started to start their new colonies, which you can see on the right here. So they start to build their nest, and we even have a few that have produced their first round of new worker bees over the last couple of weeks. So what we plan to do is we're going to monitor these colonies throughout the whole of their growth stage, just to see if there's any more differences between pesticide treatments throughout the rest of the summer. Another research question that I'm looking at is how pesticides affect bumblebee and solitary bee behavior, and in turn their success in delivering pollination services. So again, this involves me using commercial colonies and exposing these bees to pesticides through their feed. But then I take them to these big fruit cages that we have on UCD campus and looking at their behavior in a more finer detail. So I can bring these bees inside and have plants and crops in the cages and watch their behavior more closely. And it allows me to record things like how long a bee spends on a specific flower, or how long their total foraging trip is before they return to the colony box. And then after the experiment, I can actually measure the yield of all these crops and compare the difference between crops that had been pollinated by bees that were just normal control bees and also bees that were pesticide bees. So this is quite important data to collect also. So I'm going to do a lot more of this over the next few months. I have some predicted results to show you, for example. So I would expect that for a bee, how long they spend on average on a specific flower would be a lot lower with a bee that has been treated with pesticide than a bee that hadn't. And from this, we'd expect to see results in the yields of the crop that they pollinated. So if we take strawberries, for example, I would expect that control normal bees would produce loads of really nice, big, red, sweet strawberries. But for bees that pollinate strawberries and they've been exposed to pesticides, we might expect fewer, smaller strawberries that don't ripen quite properly. Sometimes they have a bit of a funny deformed shape as well if they don't pollinate them properly. So all of this data gives us an idea of whether actually wild bees in the field are being affected by pesticide exposure and what this means for the pollination services that we're benefiting from. And it can also allow us to put a bit of an economic value on the damage that this change is doing. So the hopes of my research is basically, I'd love to be able to inform government policy and sort of provide this data that they can take into account before they register new pesticide products before they go on the market, and also to help influence maybe how they recommend to spray and use them throughout the year. And hopes as well that my general findings is just going to be one step closer to kind of achieving a sustainable agricultural industry in Ireland and both further afield, because agriculture is so important to make sure that we sustain a good food supply worldwide, which is just not achievable without the services that these pollinators and bees provide. So it's quite integral that we actually address these concerns and answer these questions now before it's too late to reverse the decline of these bees and other pollinators. Thank you so much for listening, and I am looking forward to taking your questions.